My parents betrayed me. They sued me to take away my company. It turned out that the judge is the father of my best friend. I never quite knew why my parents hated me. It wasn't like they came right out and said it, but they didn't have to. The way they looked at me, the way they talked to me, like I was an inconvenience, an extra mouth to feed they didn't ask for, said it all. Some people have this idea that family is supposed to be a safety net, a place you can return to no matter how badly you screw up, but that wasn't my experience. From as early as I can remember, I felt like a ghost in my own home. My parents were good at making sure the world thought they were perfect. They played the roles. My mom, the doting housewife with a plastered-on smile, and my dad, the hardworking provider who sacrificed everything for his family. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. My mom would snap at me for the smallest things. A glass left out on the counter was a mortal sin. I learned to eat quietly, keep my head down, and never make eye contact, because eye contact always led to something worse. My father wasn't much better. He didn't scream like my mother, but his disappointment was palpable. His silence was suffocating, and in many ways, worse than the verbal abuse. He would ignore me for days on end, only speaking to tell me what a failure I was becoming. He'd compare me to other kids in the neighborhood, kids who were winning awards, excelling in sports, or just generally living the kind of life he expected me to lead. "Why can't you be like them?" he'd say. "You don't even try." But I did try. I tried so hard. I studied, stayed out of trouble, kept my head down, and worked hard in school. None of it mattered. It was like I was born into a family that never wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to change their minds. As I got older, things got worse. The isolation I felt at home followed me into every aspect of my life. I didn't know how to interact with other people, didn't know how to make friends. My parents' disapproval clung to me like a second skin, and it was almost as if the other kids could smell it on me. In school, I was invisible. I sat in the back of the class, never raised my hand, never spoke unless someone spoke to me first. And even then, my answers were short, mumbled, barely audible. I didn't want attention. Attention meant questions, and questions meant I had to explain things about my life that I didn't have the words for. So, I stayed quiet. I wasn't bullied, exactly, but I was ignored. In a way, I preferred it that way. The idea of being noticed, of someone trying to get close to me, was terrifying. What if they found out how broken I really was? By the time I got to high school, I had perfected the art of invisibility. I was the kid who slipped through the cracks. Teachers barely remembered my name, and I never participated in any extracurricular activities. My grades were decent, not enough to stand out, but not so bad that they'd warrant concern. I figured if I could just keep my head down long enough, I'd eventually make it to college, where I could escape the suffocating grip of my parents. College became this distant, unreachable fantasy. A way out, a way to start over. I didn't care where I went. I just wanted to get as far away from home as possible. The worst part about growing up in that house was the loneliness. Even when my parents weren't actively criticizing me, their absence was just as loud. It was as if the house was hollow, with nothing but the sound of silence echoing through the walls. There were no hugs, no words of encouragement, no moments of comfort. Just silence and cold stares. I spent most of my free time locked in my room, reading books or listening to music. Books were my escape, the only place I could lose myself in a world where things made sense. In those pages, I could be anyone but myself. I devoured novels like they were lifelines, stories about people who faced challenges and overcame them, people who found love, people who were wanted. It was a stark contrast to my reality, where I was nothing more than an afterthought. I didn't have friends, not really. There were a few kids at school who would talk to me sometimes, but I never let them get too close. Trust wasn't something I gave easily, and I wasn't sure I even knew how to make friends. The idea of opening up to someone, of letting them into my world, was too much. What would I even say? "Hi, my name's Name, and my parents hate me?" No, it was easier to keep my distance, to stay in the background, unnoticed. College was my way out, and I was determined to make it. I applied to every school that was far away from my hometown, schools that wouldn't require me to come home on weekends or holidays. I didn't care about prestige or reputation. I just needed distance. When the acceptance letters started rolling in, I could hardly believe it. I was going to leave. I was going to be free. I ended up choosing a small university several states away. It wasn't anything special, but it was far enough that I knew I wouldn't have to deal with my parents. That was all I needed. I packed my bags the summer after high school, and when the day came for me to leave, my parents didn't even bother to drive me to the airport. My mom gave me a half-hearted good luck as I loaded my bags into the taxi, and my dad barely looked up from his newspaper. It was like I didn't even exist. The first few weeks of college were overwhelming. I was surrounded by people, students, professors, campus staff, but I felt more alone than ever. Everyone else seemed to be adjusting just fine, making friends, joining clubs, living their best lives. Meanwhile, I was struggling to even leave my dorm room. I had no idea how to talk to people, how to make connections. The thought of walking into a crowded cafeteria or a packed lecture hall made my stomach churn. So, I kept to myself, just like I always had. My dorm was a small, cramped space shared with a guy named Brian. He was friendly enough, but we didn't really have much in common. He was into sports and partying, while I preferred the quiet solitude of my books. We got along fine, but we weren't friends. I didn't think I was capable of making friends, not after years of being taught that I was unworthy of attention. Classes were a welcome distraction. I threw myself into my studies, determined to keep my grades up. If nothing else, I could at least prove to myself that I wasn't a complete failure. The academic pressure was intense, but it was nothing compared to the constant judgment I had grown up with. In a way, I thrived under the weight of the coursework, using it as an excuse to avoid social situations. It wasn't until the second semester of my freshman year that everything changed. I was sitting in the campus library, as usual, when someone knocked into my table, sending my stack of books tumbling to the floor. I looked up, startled, and saw a guy around my age standing there, looking just as surprised as I was. His backpack was half open, and books were spilling out everywhere. "Shit, I'm sorry," he said, kneeling to gather up my books. I hesitated for a moment, then bent down to help him. Our hands brushed against each other as we reached for the same book, and I quickly pulled away, feeling a strange sense of discomfort. I wasn't used to people touching me, not even accidentally. "No worries," I muttered, not really looking at him. But he didn't just leave after that. He sat down across from me, flashing me a grin that was so genuine, it caught me off guard. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, though he had already pulled out a chair. I shrugged, unsure of what to say. I wasn't used to people wanting to be around me. Most of the time, they avoided me altogether. But this guy didn't seem fazed by my awkwardness. He just plopped down and started pulling out notebooks and textbooks, as if we were old friends. "Name's Josh, by the way," he said after a moment, glancing up at me. "You? Name," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Name," he said with that same easygoing smile. "You always study here?" I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. For the next hour, we sat in relative silence, each of us focused on our own work. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence I had grown accustomed to. It was peaceful. There was something calming about Josh's presence, like he didn't expect anything from me. He wasn't judging me, wasn't waiting for me to screw up. He was just there, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to put up a wall. Over the next few weeks, Josh and I fell into an easy routine. We'd bump into each other at the library or in the cafeteria, and we'd sit together, not really talking but just being. It was strange, having someone around who didn't make me feel like I was being scrutinized or judged. Josh was the first person who seemed to genuinely like me for who I was, without any expectations or conditions. He didn't push me to open up, didn't ask invasive questions. He just existed alongside me, and that was enough. I didn't realize how much I needed a friend until Josh came into my life. He was the opposite of everything I had grown up with, kind, patient, and understanding. He never asked me about my family, and I never volunteered the information. But there was an unspoken understanding between us. He knew I had my demons, and he didn't pry. In return, I didn't ask about his past, though I suspected it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows either. Josh had this way of making life feel a little lighter, like maybe, just maybe, Things didn't have to be so damn hard all the time. He was the kind of guy who could find humor in almost anything, and I found myself laughing more in those few months than I had in my entire life. It was strange how easily he could make me forget about the weight I carried. As the years passed, we became inseparable. We tackled everything together: exams, late-night study sessions, even the occasional party, though those weren't really my thing. Josh was the first real friend I had ever had, and I clung to that friendship like it was a lifeline. He made me feel like I wasn't alone in the world, like maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. When graduation rolled around, we both knew what we had to do. Neither of us was going back to our old lives. There was nothing left for us there. We wanted to start fresh, to escape the ghosts of our pasts and build something new. So, we packed up our things, pooled what little money we had, and hit the road. It was reckless, spontaneous, and completely terrifying. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I had control over my own destiny. We ended up in a big city, far from the small towns we had grown up in. The noise, the crowds, the sheer size of it all was overwhelming at first, but there was something comforting about the anonymity. No one knew who we were. No one cared about our pasts. We could be anyone we wanted to be. We found a tiny, run-down apartment that we could barely afford, but it didn't matter. It was ours. It was the first place I had ever lived that felt like a home, even if it was falling apart at the seams. We scraped by, working dead-end jobs, but we were free, and that was all that mattered. For a while, things were good, better than I could have ever imagined. Josh and I were carving out a life for ourselves, away from the pain and rejection that had defined our childhoods. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the darkness that lingered inside me. There were nights when I'd lie awake in that cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling, and the memories would flood back. The way my mother would sneer at me, the way my father's silence cut deeper than any words could. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't good enough, that I would never be good enough. Josh tried to help, in his own way. He dragged me out of the apartment, forced me to go to parties or explore the city with him. He'd crack jokes, tell me stories about his own messed-up childhood, and remind me that we were free now. But freedom wasn't as simple as leaving. It wasn't just about getting away from the physical place. It was about healing, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to do that. One night, after too many drinks and a particularly rough day at work, I broke down. We were sitting on the rooftop of our building, looking out over the city lights, when it all just came pouring out. I told Josh everything, about my parents, about the years of abuse, about how I had spent my entire life feeling like I didn't matter. I don't know what I expected, maybe pity or discomfort, but Josh just listened. He didn't try to fix me or tell me that everything would be okay. He just sat there, letting me unload years of pain that I had been carrying in silence. And somehow, in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. Josh and I had always joked about starting our own business back in college, usually during those long, caffeine-fueled nights in the library. It was always a half-serious fantasy, something we talked about when we were exhausted and sick of the idea of working for someone else. But now, after moving to the city and realizing just how crushing it felt to be cogs in someone else's machine, that joke began to feel like a real possibility. We were both stuck in jobs we hated. Josh was working at a dead-end IT job, and I was slogging through freelance coding gigs that barely covered my half of the rent. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Josh looked at me and said, "Why don't we just do it? Start our own company." At first, I thought he was still joking. We were broke, inexperienced, and didn't know the first thing about running a business. But the more we talked, the more serious it became. We weren't living the lives we wanted. Why not take a shot at something bigger? We had both spent the last several years honing our tech skills, and there was no shortage of small businesses in the city that needed web development help. After weeks of planning, we officially launched our business. We called it Neon Pinnacle Solutions, inspired by the glowing skyline of the city we were trying to make our mark in. It was just the two of us at first, working out of our cramped apartment, huddled over our laptops at a table that doubled as our kitchen counter. We couldn't afford an office yet, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that we were finally in control of our own fate. Business was slow at first. We sent out hundreds of emails and made dozens of cold calls, trying to get even the smallest of clients to give us a chance. Most of them ignored us, some laughed us off, but eventually, we landed a few small projects, basic websites for local cafes and gyms. The money wasn't great, but it was a start. We were getting by, barely. Then, we caught a break. A small fashion boutique called Silk Threads, run by an ambitious woman named Leah Morales, hired us to redesign their website. Leah had a sharp eye for potential and saw something in our work. Her online store was clunky and outdated, and she wanted a complete overhaul. This was the kind of project we had been dreaming of, something bigger, something that could put us on the map. We worked nonstop for weeks, pouring everything we had into building a sleek, intuitive website that matched the elegance of her brand. When we finally showed Leah the finished product, she was thrilled. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said, her eyes lighting up as she navigated through the site. "You guys are going to go far." Leah didn't just become a client. She became our biggest advocate. She told everyone she knew about us, and soon enough, word of mouth started spreading. More businesses began reaching out, wanting us to do for them what we had done for Leah. It was exhilarating, and suddenly, we weren't just scraping by anymore. We were building something real. As our business grew, so did the attention we were getting from competitors. Most of them didn't see us as a threat at first. We were just two young guys working out of a dingy apartment, while they had years of experience in big corporate offices. But one company, in particular, seemed to take notice. Pulseline Technologies was a well-established IT firm, handling everything from web development to network infrastructure for mid-sized businesses across the city. They'd been around for over a decade and had built a solid reputation. Their CEO, Darren Cross, reached out to us under the guise of exploring opportunities for collaboration. We met Darren at his office, a sleek, modern space that felt worlds apart from our messy living room. He was tall, with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. From the moment we sat down, it was clear that Darren wasn't interested in collaboration. He wanted to eliminate us as competition before we could grow any further. He offered to buy us out, flashing a check that seemed impossibly large considering how little we had in our bank accounts at the time. "You guys have a lot of potential," Darren said, leaning back in his chair. "But potential only gets you so far. Let me help you. Take the money, come under the Pulseline umbrella, and you'll be set for life. Otherwise, this city has a way of chewing up small operations like yours." I glanced at Josh, expecting some hesitation, but he didn't flinch. He stood up from his chair, his voice steady. "We're not selling," he said. "Thanks for the offer, but we're good." I stood up next to him, echoing the same sentiment. Darren's smile faded, and I could feel the shift in the room. We had just made a powerful enemy, and we knew it. As we walked out of the office, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we'd done. It was a bold move, but there was no turning back now. Pulseline didn't take long to make its move. Within weeks, we started losing clients. Projects that were in the final stages fell through, and businesses that had shown interest in us suddenly stopped returning our calls. We heard through the grapevine that Pulseline was offering deep discounts to undercut us, stealing away clients with promises of better deals. It was a dirty move, but we expected it. Instead of panicking, Josh and I decided to take a different approach. We couldn't compete with Pulseline on price. They had far more resources than we did, but we could offer something they couldn't: personalized service. We focused on building deeper relationships with our clients, showing them that we weren't just another faceless company trying to make a quick buck. We cared about their success, and that made all the difference. One of our biggest tests came with a small tech startup called Bytecore. They had been close to signing a deal with us when Pulseline swooped in and offered them a significantly lower rate. It was a huge blow, but Josh wasn't ready to give up. "We're not going to lose this one," he said, determined. We set up a meeting with Adam Jensen, Bytecore's founder, and laid everything on the table. We couldn't match Pulseline's price, but we could offer them something they wouldn't get anywhere else: commitment. "Look, Pulseline's a big company," Josh told Adam. "They'll give you a great rate, but once the ink dries on that contract, you'll just be another number to them. We're small, yeah, but that means we're invested in your success. We're going to be with you every step of the way, making sure you get what you need." Adam listened, and after a long pause, he finally nodded. "All right," he said. Let's do it. It was a small victory, but it felt like a major turning point. Word began to spread that Neon Pinnacle wasn't just another company offering cookie-cutter solutions. We were different. We cared about our clients in ways that bigger companies didn't. And slowly but surely, we started winning more business. With the influx of new clients came new challenges. Josh and I realized that we couldn't handle everything on our own anymore. We were working insane hours, taking on more projects than we could realistically manage, and it was starting to take a toll on us. We needed help. The first person we brought on board was Maya Patel, a brilliant programmer with a background in cybersecurity. She had been working for a larger corporation, but the corporate grind had worn her down, and she was looking for something different. We clicked with her immediately. Maya was sharp, quick on her feet, and had a way of solving problems that seemed impossible to me. With her on board, we could finally expand our services and take on more complex projects. Next, we hired Eli Parker, a talented graphic designer with an eye for detail and a passion for creating visually stunning websites. Eli was quiet, introverted, but his work spoke volumes. He had an incredible ability to take a client's vague ideas and turn them into something beautiful. With Maya and Eli on our team, Neon Pinnacle felt like a real company for the first time. We moved out of our apartment and into a small office downtown, which was a huge milestone for us. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was ours. We were building something tangible, something that had the potential to grow far beyond the two of us. But the more successful we became, the harder Pulseline pushed back. Darren wasn't going to let us take his clients without a fight. Rumors spread that Pulseline had started using underhanded tactics to sabotage us. At first, we didn't believe it, but then something happened that changed everything. We were in the middle of a major project for a logistics company called TransitSync when our systems were hit with a massive cyber attack. Our servers were compromised, and sensitive client data was at risk. It was the kind of nightmare scenario that could destroy a company like ours. Maya worked tirelessly to contain the breach and assess the damage. She spent 3 days straight in the office, barely sleeping, as she tried to track down the source of the attack. When she finally cracked it, what she found shocked us. The attack had been orchestrated by Pulseline. They had hired an external contractor to hack into our systems, hoping to destroy us from the inside. We were furious, but instead of going public with the information, we decided to play it smart. Maya had gathered enough evidence to expose Pulseline's involvement, but we didn't want to blow up the situation just yet. Instead, we quietly approached key players in the industry, clients, partners, and even some of Pulseline's own employees, and let them know what kind of company they were dealing with. The fallout was swift. Clients began pulling out of deals with Pulseline, questioning their ethics and integrity. Employees started leaving, unwilling to be associated with a company that played dirty. It wasn't a total collapse, but it was enough to give us breathing room. With Pulseline out of the picture, we were able to focus on growing Neon Pinnacle even further. We expanded our services, offering app development, digital marketing, and cybersecurity consulting. Our client base grew rapidly, and before long, we had outgrown our small office. We moved into a larger space downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. As exciting as the growth was, it brought new pressures. Josh and I were no longer just developers. We were now running a company with a full team of employees. Every decision we made had consequences, and the weight of that responsibility was something we hadn't fully anticipated. Josh thrived in the chaos, loving the fast pace and constant challenges, but I found myself struggling with the pressure. The more successful we became, the more I doubted myself. I had spent so much of my life feeling like I wasn't good enough, and even with all our success, those feelings hadn't disappeared. In the midst of our growth, we caught the attention of Vector Dynamics, a global tech giant known for swallowing up smaller companies. Their CEO, Marcus Voss, reached out to us, offering what seemed like an incredible opportunity. He wanted to invest in Neon Pinnacle, offering a massive influx of capital in exchange for a significant stake in the company. The money was tempting, more than we had ever dreamed of, but there was a catch. If we accepted, we would lose a lot of control over the company. Marcus was smooth, charismatic, and persuasive, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. He talked about Neon Pinnacle like it was just another asset in his portfolio, something he could use to increase his bottom line. I could see the wheels turning in Josh's head as Marcus laid out his offer, but when the meeting ended, we knew what we had to do. We turned him down. We didn't build this company just to sell it off, Josh said afterward. This is ours. We'll keep growing it ourselves. And so we did. I never thought I'd see my parents again. They had faded into the background of my life, a distant, painful memory I had worked hard to bury. When I left home, I didn't just leave physically. I severed the emotional ties, or at least I thought I had. But then one afternoon, they appeared in my life again, right when everything was finally going right. It started with a knock at my office door. Maya, our lead in cybersecurity, entered hesitantly. It was strange to see her like that. Maya was always confident and unshakable. "There's someone here to see you," she said, avoiding my gaze. I looked up from my desk, puzzled. "Who?" "It's your parents." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. My parents? The very people I had worked so hard to distance myself from, now standing just outside my door? I felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and a bit of fear. They hadn't been a part of my life for nearly a decade, and now, out of nowhere, they had found their way back. "Send them in," I said, my voice much calmer than I felt. Maya disappeared, and moments later, the door opened again. There they stood, my father, his eyes still as cold as ever, and my mother with that same, tight-lipped smile I had grown to hate. They looked older, more worn down by time, but nothing about their demeanor had changed. "Look at you," my father said, his voice oozing condescension as he scanned my office. "All grown up. You've done well for yourself." I didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want?" "We're here to talk about your business," my mother said, stepping forward with her forced smile. "You've made quite a success of yourself. We think it's time you gave something back." "Gave something back?" I repeated, stunned by the audacity. "After all," my father chimed in, "we raised you. We gave you the foundation you needed to get to where you are now." I let out a bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. You didn't give me anything but grief. Everything I have, I built on my own. You didn't support me. You barely acknowledged I existed." My father's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone. You think you got here without us? We made you." "No, you didn't," I shot back, standing up. "I made myself, despite you, not because of you. I'm not giving you anything." For a moment, the room was heavy with tension. My father's cold gaze locked on mine. Then, his voice dropped to a deadly calm. "We're not asking. My parents weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take. You actually think you can just walk in here and demand control over my company?" I said, incredulous. My mother's smile vanished. "You'll regret this." Without another word, they turned and left, slamming the door behind them. I stood there for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. They couldn't seriously believe they had any claim over what I had built. It was absurd. But knowing them, this wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I found out just how serious they were. A letter arrived from a law firm representing my parents, informing me that they were suing me for a share of Neon Pinnacle. They claimed they had invested in my upbringing and education, and without their support, I wouldn't have been able to start the company. They were demanding half of everything I owned. I stared at the letter, my blood boiling. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. They couldn't stand that I had succeeded without them. So now they were trying to take what I had built through legal manipulation. I immediately called Josh. He was just as outraged as I was. "They can't do this," he said. "They have no right. They've got a high-profile lawyer, Richard Maddox," I explained. "They're going to fight dirty." "We'll fight back," Josh said, his voice firm. "We're not going to let them win." We hired Samantha Brooks, one of the best attorneys in the city. From the moment I met her, I knew we were in good hands. She was tough, no nonsense, and had a track record of winning impossible cases. "They have no case," Samantha said after reviewing the documents. "Their claims are baseless. But their lawyer, Maddox, is known for dragging things out and playing dirty. This won't be easy, but we can win." The months leading up to the trial were a blur of stress and preparation. I couldn't believe I was about to fight my own parents in court, But there was no turning back now. They were trying to take everything from me, and I wasn't going to let that happen. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators and reporters. My parents had made sure this was a public spectacle. They sat across from me, looking smug and confident, as though they believed victory was already in their grasp. Maddox wasted no time painting them as loving, supportive parents who had sacrificed everything to give me the best opportunities in life. He claimed they had financially supported me throughout my education and that without their help, I never would have been able to start Neon Pinnacle. Listening to him was nauseating. My parents sat there nodding along, as though they believed the lies Maddox was spinning. But Samantha was prepared. She countered every argument with cold, hard facts. She presented evidence of my scholarships, my part-time jobs, and the complete lack of support from my parents. She exposed their claims for what they were, fabrications designed to manipulate the court. Day after day, the trial dragged on. Maddox continued to use every trick in the book, twisting the truth and trying to sway the jury with emotional manipulation. But Samantha was relentless. She was brilliant, dismantling his arguments piece by piece. Then, something unexpected happened. The judge presiding over the case, Marcus Caldwell, was someone I recognized. He was Josh's father. I hadn't known that Josh's dad was a judge. Josh had never mentioned it, and I had never asked. But there he was, sitting at the head of the courtroom, overseeing the trial. I was worried at first. I didn't want anyone thinking this was rigged or unfair. But Judge Caldwell was a man of integrity, and it was clear from the start that he wasn't going to let personal connections interfere with his duty. He listened carefully to both sides, never showing any favoritism, and treated the case with the seriousness it deserved. The tension in the courtroom built as the trial came to a close. Both sides had presented their final arguments, and now it was up to Judge Caldwell to make a decision. I sat there, my heart pounding, waiting for the moment that would determine the future of my company. The room was silent as Judge Caldwell addressed the court. He acknowledged the emotional appeals made by my parents and their lawyer, but emphasized the importance of facts in a case like this. He spoke with authority as he laid out the truth, that I had built Neon Pinnacle without any assistance from my parents, that their claims were unfounded, and that they had no legal right to my business. But then, he turned his attention to my parents' behavior throughout the case. He didn't mince words. Their attempts to manipulate the court, fabricate evidence, and present false claims were not just morally reprehensible, they were illegal. I watched as my parents' smug expressions slowly faded, replaced by shock and disbelief. Judge Caldwell made it clear that their actions had not gone unnoticed. They had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. As the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity, I sat there, stunned by what had just happened. It was over. I had won. Not only had I defended my company, but my parents were now facing charges for their fraudulent behavior. I stepped outside the courthouse, the sun shining brighter than it had in years. The weight of the trial, of my parents, of everything they had put me through, was finally gone. Josh was waiting for me, a huge grin on his face. "You did it, man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "We did it," I replied. Without Josh, without Samantha, without Judge Caldwell, none of this would have been possible. As we walked away from the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel lighter. I had fought my parents and won, but more than that, I had freed myself from the shadow they had cast over my life for so long. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. The battle was over, but I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I was finally free to live on my own terms,